Ian Kershaw, what was your motivation for writing this book?
I wanted to understand my own lifetime a bit better and to see what the context was in which I had experienced my life. Of course, there are always pragmatic reasons for writing history books, and the reason that this enterprise was undertaken initially was because I was asked to do it by the publishers. But I did think it was a very exciting opportunity to understand the history of my own times better, and to learn from that my own place in that history, how I'd grown up with things around me that I didn't at the time comprehend, but through studying it then you get a better understanding of where you've come from.
Okay, thank you. How about you use the metaphor roller coaster? Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, we tend, I think, automatically to think of post-war European history as somewhat of a one-way street to progress and prosperity and peace, of course. And that's not unfair, but there are other perspectives of European history. If you look at it from, say, the perspective of Yugoslavia or Ukraine or somewhere, or Southern Europe, it doesn't quite look like that. And I wanted to embrace the whole of Europe in this book, and not just the part which we're familiar with in Western Europe or the European Union. And therefore I wanted to see Europe as a Europe since 1945 of movement, of things, of crises that come and go, of ups and downs, of setbacks as well as progress, and to see it not just in a straight line, but rather this switchback notion that a roller coaster suggests. It's not a perfect metaphor, of course, but it nonetheless does bring in this suggestion of vitality and movement and change and ups and downs, and that's what I wanted to capture with the title.
What is your definition of Europe?
I don't have any obvious definition in writing this book or writing the predecessor volumes. Of course, you can define Europe in a whole number of different ways. You do it geographically. Where does Europe end? In Eastern Europe, at any rate. Possibly the Ural Mountains in the center of Russia. The western borders of Europe are more obvious through the Atlantic. But that's geographical definition is one thing. Cultural definition, we see wherever we go in Europe, right from Moscow to Madrid, we see patterns of similar culture. They also help to define what Europe is. We have, of course, similar, and until relatively recently, Europe has been in the main a Christian continent, so you have the legacy of the Christian churches, although that's been often as divisive as it's been unifying. And we have, naturally, the historical legacy of what makes Europe, the legacy of the two world wars and the aftermath of rebuilding after the Second War. So you have a political entity, economic entity, and cultural entity, even maybe a religious one. All those together, as well as the geographic one, come to make up what we understand as Europe.
Is the current situation in the UK a reflection of lingering imperialistic thoughts or dreams?
The current situation, chaotic as it is, partly reflects longer-term trends in Britain. Britain was always half-hearted about Europe, right from joining in 1973. It saw it as an economic entity. We felt at that time, I remember it distinctly, we felt we were joining a common market, an economic entity. From the early 1990s onwards, Europe has moved increasingly towards defining itself as a political entity, the European Union, and parts of the Conservative Party in Britain were always antagonistic towards these trends of ever closer union. They were happy enough with the economic side, but not with the political side. It has to be said, however, that you can't arrive at the present difficulties of a Brexit just through the long-term past. As recently as 2011 or 12, Europe didn't figure very prominently in the views of most people about what was important in their lives. Opinion surveys do these questions about attitudes and so on, what's important for you. The European Union was not high up on the list. But I think when you look at the changes that were taking place since the early 2000s with the widening of the European Union to the east, beginning of migration, mass migration into Britain and other parts of Europe from the former Eastern Bloc. That was the start of changing attitudes. And then you had on top of that the aftermath of the economic crisis, the finance crisis of 2008 and the austerity politics that followed that, which caused a great deal of anger and resentment, I think, in the population, much of which was then directed towards this migration problem and towards Brussels. And then thirdly, on top of that, you had then the impact of the refugee crisis in Europe in 2015 and 16. And all these brought the question of migration to the top of the poll of things that were interesting people most important in their lives. And that was really the background to this referendum result in 2016. The referendum result itself then led to Theresa May, the new, somewhat accidental Prime Minister, instead of looking for a compromise then, taking the side of the Brexit supporters and even the side of some who wanted a hard Brexit. And the result of that has been an inability to find any solution in the country to this problem. We are now edging towards what I hope will be a solution in the near future, but it's of course very dramatic. It's wonderful political theatre. It's just my country that's been ruined in the meanwhile.
Yeah. So, could you say that sometimes maybe the recent changes we have is, for example, the media, the social media, where people, for example, get a lot of frustration, get out with those frustration. Do you think that's a part of the thing to blame, or?
Well, we're looking at wider issues than Britain, aren't we, in the rise of populism in practically all European countries. And I would say that the social media have contributed to the rapidity with which then these ideas can be spread. They haven't actually created the ideas in the first place. So it's an accelerator of trends that were already there. Actually, you can see these trends going way back to the 1980s already then. Jörg Haider's movement in Austria was getting over 20% of the support, and Marine Le Pen's father, Jean Le Pen, was already getting, I think, 17 or more % of the support in France. So it isn't something that's developed overnight, but the social media are able now to, of course, spread attitudes and feelings and anger and resentment very rapidly, and so that's contributed then to the speed with which these movements have developed in the last few years.
How about, for example, Facebook and how the media functions as a use, for example, try to what shall I say, try to show you what you want to see, for example. It tries to, through cookies enabling, it tries to tell you what is it you want to see, and then you see more content of that similarity.
Well, I think people are often persuaded by views expressed which reinforce the views they already had themselves anyway, and Facebook and other media do that, of course, very rapidly and very intensively, and within minutes you can get a response then practically across the world for opinions that you hold, and these then can easily reinforce views which otherwise will be exposed to a more critical exposure. So,
do you have any advice for future generation of historians?
I would say don't rush into trying to become professional historians. That's a very precarious path. Carry on doing the work. History is a very good basis for understanding the world around us and for understanding where we've come from, and it's a very good background for critical analysis of all the issues that face us. It's very enticing for people then to see the attraction of this and want to become professional historians. I think you then need a lot of good luck on the side to take that particular path. I'm glad that both of my sons decided not to go into becoming professional historians. They enjoy history enormously, benefit from it, have it as a wonderful hobby, but they don't have to pretend that they're practicing professional historians. That's the way forward.
Okay, so the last question I have, what is the next volume in European history that needs to be written?
Oh, who knows? What's almost certain is that I won't be writing it, or maybe a history of the future will be the next one. But no, I don't know. Things are moving very fast. We need obviously some perspective. This book that I've just written now comes more or less up to the present day. It was the present day when I finished writing it, and you see the difficulties, of course, then in interpreting something which is very recent. So we need time to see what the passage of history means, and who knows how things will develop in the next 20, 30 years. So whoever writes the next volume will be very courageous, I think.
Thank you very much.
Great pleasure. Great pleasure.